Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Great, thank you all for coming. So today we have Jim Kuipers here. Jim is a mining environmental consultant and principal with Kuipers & Associates based in Wisdom, Montana. He received a BS degree from Montana College of Mineral Science and Technology. And he's been working in the field of mining and mining consulting for 40 years. He's worked for a wide variety of groups, and he's here today. He's working with Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy on issues of proposed mining projects in Minnesota. So, and the topic today is financial assurance for one of those projects, the PolyMet thing. So, Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I never expect a large audience for financial assurance discussions, and I was right this time, so that's good. Really appreciate the chance to talk with you. Just a little bit more about my background. I grew up in a mining family, was raised basically in the mining industry, and worked in the industry until 1996. At that point, I decided to take a little different turn. Really didn't know where that turn was going to lead me, but eventually it led me to working for environmental groups, conservation groups, various other organizations to help them address mining issues. And as a mining engineer, that's always been a bit of a challenge in working with these folks. But at the same time, I can tell you it's been a very worthwhile and good endeavor for the last 20 years. So Montana has a lot of history with financial assurance issues. It's one of the reasons why I've been working on it for more than 20 years now. We probably more than any other state have experienced the negative side of what can happen when mining companies go bankrupt. As a result, we've also learned a lot of things about what we should or shouldn't do with financial assurance. The idea of financial assurance is that essentially we have a company or a corporation undertaking activities affecting public lands and resources, hard rock mining being a very good example of that. And the idea is to provide funding to perform the reclamation and closure. This is essentially the costs that occur after the mining project has been conducted. Now, very importantly, a presumption we use in financial assurance is that it's used in the event of bankruptcy or foreclosure. So mining companies don't care to have us assume they're going bankrupt, but the reality is with financial assurance, we have to make that assumption. That's the whole idea, and that's the history, is that many mining companies have gone bankrupt and had to walk away from liabilities and things. The funding amount is typically based on the planned or predicted tasks. Now, when we talk about contingencies for acid drainage, things like that, that's something we need to predict. The idea isn't to put a contingency in place. We actually need to predict it and then estimate the cost for that. And so it's very important we have an accurate plan and accurate predictions. And then typically it's required by state and federal regulatory agencies. However, when you review all the different agency requirements, they're not at all consistent. It seems like each state kind of seems to do its own thing without listening a whole lot, and then the feds do their own thing as well. When we do cost estimation for financial assurance, once we have a task, and essentially what we're trying to do is figure out the amount of money we need to perform the tasks that are necessary at the end. So again, it's very important we identify accurately what tasks are necessary. When I started working in this 25 years ago, you saw probably every imaginable type of estimate, from back of the envelope, back of the napkin type estimates to very detailed engineering estimates. Today, 25 years later, there is a standard engineering practice that's recognized as being required for these type of estimates. They're the same engineering cost estimates that I would make if I were trying to build or design a mine, at that same high level of quality and accuracy. So again, we need the site-specific and current mine cleanup plan. And then again, the cost estimating uncertainty results from the accuracy of the predictions, and this is whether they're going to have water treatment requirements long-term or not, what other maybe long-term other requirements they have. And then there are also inaccuracies that are inherent to the estimating process. Now, as an engineer, I can deal with that second set, those inaccuracies inherent to the estimating process, by putting in place an engineering contingency. but I really don't have a good way to do that with respect to predictions and those not being accurate. Another thing that we have to address when we look at cost estimation is the amount of information we have available. When you're doing pre-permitting, when we're talking about the conceptual designs and things, really the best degree of accuracy you can have is a plus or minus 50 to 100. That's what an engineer would tell you based upon the limited conceptual information you have, the accuracy. Now, as we go further down the life, you can see at permitting and startup, we get to about 30 to plus 60. When we have operations, we're still dealing with that minus 30 plus 60 range. And then end of mine life, that's really when we finally get to detailed design, plus 10 or minus 10 plus 25% type estimate. These are all, the degree of accuracy is from some standard engineering textbooks, by the way. And the idea is that we really don't know with great definition what that cost is until the end of the mine life. We have to get the design done. So this is a graphic that, let me grab my pointer here. What we're showing here in the, on the left is the dollars, and we might think of this as $1 million, tens of millions, and hundreds of millions of dollars. And then along here we have the project life that we're looking at. And what we usually do is start up a permitting with an idea that's going to cost X amount, and it keeps on going, you can see, relatively modestly. And when mining's done, they walk away. If you look at the blue line, or the green, excuse me, it's intended to show what the actual amount is likely to be. So during the permitting, oftentimes what we have is we have an indirect cost between the cost estimate and financial assurance. The company, for example, is saying it's going to cost $20 million, but they forget that it might cost the agencies another 30 or 40% to do that work. They have indirect and overhead costs. Then we get further into construction, and a good example is what happens is we thought the financial assurance was here, but they changed the mine plan. Oftentimes when a new company might come in and buy an operation, and I think that's something that's possible for any proposed mine, the new company coming in will have its own idea of how to mine it. They might want to mine a little more or mine a little differently, so they can end up with a gap there. Now where the big gap has traditionally occurred is once they start operating, we suddenly determined that they had acid generation potential. And this is real important in those cases where they did not predict that acid generation potential, because you can get this kind of a gap. Ultimately, it can lead to a difference between tens and hundreds of millions of dollars. And very importantly, there's no walk-away scenario when we have acid generation and need water treatment. We get into this perpetual treatment scenario. So what's traditionally happened is we might expect that we need, say, 1 to 10 million for cleanup, when in fact, if we have that acid generation as a comparative measure, it's 10 to 100 million. So it basically goes up by an order of magnitude or even more in some cases. Now, how do we avoid some of these issues? The first is we need to develop a reclamation and closure plan, and including revisions with that. Needs to be accurate, describe the actual site features, and it needs to identify plans for cleanup of all the features of the site. Surface features, facilities, operations, various mitigations that may be necessary long-term, any other activities that are identified. Each mine is unique, and no mine is one that you can just take one approach and use the same, because each one may have individual activities. Identification of reclamation and closure tasks. Now I put interim operations and maintenance up here at the top. This was a real lesson for Montana. Nevada also had a real learning curve on this. When a company goes bankrupt, they leave the site. They might hand you the keys, they might not even hand you the keys, but basically the next day, the regulatory agencies are responsible for operating that mine. They need money, and they need that in the form of cash almost immediately. So what we typically see now, for example, in Montana is 3 to 5 years of money to operate the mine if it closes without doing any reclamation. It may take 2 to 3 years to collect the financial assurance, to put together the final reclamation plans, things like that. Nevada has required at least 6 months So even in the most conservative mining state like Nevada, they at least are requiring some interim operations. The reality is, though, I think 3 to 5 years is more appropriate. Very important to identify water management and treatment. This is the cost by itself that basically can amount to an order of magnitude increase in financial assurance. And it's that failure to identify the need for water management and treatment, particularly long-term, that's led to some very significant bonding shortfalls. I'll show you an example of one here in a few minutes. This basically goes through the whole shopping list of what needs to be done in order to do it. A good example is monitoring is something that probably needs to go on indefinitely after the mine has been operating. It's not something you would ever expect to just discontinue and walk away. This is just a slide showing that in the direct cost estimation, we have both capital and operating costs. And then the indirect cost is a very important feature. I'll mention it a bit when we get to PolyMet, but normally the indirect costs account for engineering contingency, and again, this is a 5 or 10% contingency. This isn't a contingency for we got it wrong. That's a whole different thing. This is simply a contingency for cost estimation as an engineer, knowing you need to add 5 or 10% to give you the widgets you didn't account for. We have engineering, design, and redesign costs, MOB and demob, contractor profit, overhead, and the agencies. It turns out they end up having their employees work a whole lot more hours if a mine is under their purview and operating than they would otherwise estimate. Typically, these indirect costs range from 30% to 80%. We'll get to where PolyMet's on this in a minute. We want to determine the long-term cost in terms of net present value. Now, this is where I'm an engineer. I'm not a financial expert. I'm not an economist. This is where we really get into some crystal ball issues that become very problematic in that predicting future inflation and predicting future interest, which we use to give ourselves a net discount rate, that's very, very difficult. I challenge anybody to tell me what the interest rate's going to be in 3 years, inflation rate's going to be. We simply don't know. What we do know is the idea of financial assurance for long term is very, very sensitive to that discount rate. And I'll show that towards the end of this presentation. Finally, we have to look at the bond in terms of its form. Typically, we don't talk trust funds, but we talk surety bonds for years 3 through 10, if you will. That's really for the reclamation, for the dirt work. And then the preference by far is for a trust fund, a cash trust fund, for long-term costs. And that needs to account again for inflation and interest. And it could be calculated for, currently BLM in Nevada requires 500 years that it be calculated out for. Doesn't make a great big difference, as I'll show you. So the Zortman and Landusky mines is a case study that I oftentimes use to kind of demonstrate how bad things can get. It's also one that had a lot of different stakeholders who were affected by the mine. And it's to me, it's a very interesting example of what can happen and unfortunately all too often does. This was part of the Fort Belknap Reservation. A lot of our mines in the West, gold mines in particular, have a history with having little chunks of reservations removed for gold miners. It's located in the Little Rocky Mountains. This is kind of a mountain range that sits out in the middle of the plains, very interesting. Pegasus and Zortman Landusky, they were one of the first large-scale gold and silver open pit heap leach operations. You may be aware or not, Montana now has banned open pit heap leach mining from the state, and it's actually because of this mine and a couple of others that we did so. We've had a real problem with open pit heap leach mines over the years. Operated from 1979 to 1998, so we had about a 20-year operating period. And what's important during that operating period is to note that when it was permitted in 1979, the plan of operations was amended or changed 11 times in the subsequent roughly 10-year period. Very important you get a good mine plan to begin with and not something where they come in and say, oh, well, that one wasn't right, we'll change. What happened is in 1992, they said, well, we're going to take these two big mines and we're going to combine the two in a big super pit. And they submitted that plan, but they didn't submit any water quality data. And so the Department of Environmental Quality, others said we need to look at the water quality data. When they did, they discovered that there was widespread acid generation from the site. And when that happens, and again, this is what I think mining companies really need to work to avoid, is they were sued by everybody. And I mean literally everybody. Jumped on the bandwagon, and for good reason, because we basically had acid drainage flowing down Swift Gulch, various other places, onto the Fort Belknap Reservation. There really hadn't been much of any mitigation of the site, and the idea from the mining company of taking a bad site and making it a humongous site and even worse didn't sit well with folks. We did get a $32 million settlement on their previous groundwater pollution, but they still wanted to go ahead and expand. That was appealed by the Fort Belknap Indian community, and the IBLA, BLM-IBLA, actually stayed that expansion in '97. The next year, Pegasus filed for bankruptcy. Probably important to mention that Pegasus didn't file for bankruptcy because they couldn't expand that mine. What Pegasus did is they developed about 10 different mines in North America, all of which they kept expanding and building without accruing any debt for the reclamation and closure liability. Then they went and bought a mine in Australia called Mount Hamilton, a lead zinc mine, invested a huge amount of money into it, and went broke. Essentially, those of us in Montana, we got a call one day, and we were told the company's bankrupt, all the employees are laid off, and literally as the employees left the mine, the state and federal agency folks hired them to continue running the mine. So fortunately, at Zorman-Landusky, if they hadn't been there to operate the water treatment, the minute the operators left, we would have had discharges going down the creek and all kinds of other problems. Would have been a real mess. So, but essentially the folks had to take over the mine. Now this is a good example of what happened at Zorman-Landusky. The white or yellow bars are the actual acres, and then you can see this kind of purple is the bond amount. Well, you can see the ratio of acres to bond very low. It was about $1,000 per acre at this point. Went up to about $1,500, then $2,000 an acre at 1985. But the idea was we were just charging $1 per acre. We weren't actually accounting for a potential cost. So it wasn't until 1990 that somebody actually said we need to start looking at the actual cost, not a $2,000 per acre limit. That increased the amount there. In '93, when we started to think we had acid, they increased the bond to about $25 million. But in 1998, we realized we needed about $70 million. So trying to all of a sudden take a company that's in the throes of bankruptcy and take them from $25 to $70 million is very difficult. Some of the things that we found at Zorman-Landusky, and again, ideally these are things that should have been predicted and known right up front, is we had very significant acid drainage. We're going to need capture and treatment in perpetuity. Now, I use the word in perpetuity. I should mention that in my experience, we are going to run out of the acid at some point in the future. It might be thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years. Really, though, anything beyond about 500 years from the standpoint of money, we're not sure how to handle, you'll see. So this idea of capture and treatment in perpetuity, it is going to be a long, long time. We just really don't know the end point. Source controls are something that we found necessary at Zorman-Landusky, but let me mention, we oftentimes hear folks say source controls will eliminate the need for water treatment. I've seen very few, if any, circumstances where that were true. Liners still leak, the covers still leak, and so it decreases the amount of pollution, but typically doesn't eliminate it. We got a lot of other surprises at Zorman-Landusky. We had no idea we were going to treat for nitrates, cyanide, and selenium. These are, in the case of nitrates and cyanide, those come from the blasting agents and from the actual processing chemicals, but selenium was an element that we hadn't really looked at or considered. Turns out today, probably half the water treatment that's going on in the phosphate industry in Idaho, for example, is selenium. Mines, about a quarter of the mines I'm aware of are treating for selenium. Much, much bigger issue and much more predominant issue than we realized. Backfilling is something that's also oftentimes proposed. In this case, they proposed it to eliminate the acid generation problem. You can put the acid waste in a pit, If it's not covered with water, it doesn't do much good. It just ends up falling or leaking out of the pit. A lot of the revegetation efforts at this mine were not successful. And then this was another real kicker for us, is there were 4 100-year storm events that occurred in 20 years. Now, for those of you not familiar with NOAA's storm event predictions, they have had to go back recently and admit that we really don't have a good storm prediction system. They're reassessing those predictions, but mostly what they're doing is going to 200-year storm events, simply realizing that a more conservative level is a better approach. This kind of shows some of the details of the bonding shortfall. It's particularly interesting if you get into some of the aspects of what happened here, but essentially what we did is this total amount required, the $97 million, that's a revised reclamation plan that I and a group of people put together. I was working on behalf of the Fort Belknap community because we needed $120 million to actually carry out what was supposed to be done. So we did come up with a compromise of $97.6 million. That still left us $5 million short at Zortman, $17 million short at Landusky, various other shortfalls that we had here. The Water Treatment Trust Fund was significantly shortfall. At the end of the day, we essentially were $29 million short. We got about $1.5 million from the federal agencies, and then what I can tell you is the citizens of the state of Montana, our legislature had to basically agree to pay $16 million. That's to keep the water treatment plant operating for 50 years. We expect in Montana that we will be paying for the operation of this water treatment basically until it quits operating, thousands of years from now. So this is the kind of thing we really want to avoid, shouldn't see in a good, responsible mining operation. Just a couple of pictures of what ended up. This is a good example. The original prediction for the mine said there will not be a pit lake. As it ended up, when you went on the site, there was a pit lake, had arsenic concentrations above standards. So we ended up having to actually drill a hole and then backfill this pit so we didn't have a pit lake. So we essentially don't have a toxic issue there. This is an example of the leach pads that were placed right on top of the mountain. Now at the time that seemed kind of like a good idea. The problem is putting something on the top of the mountain means it drains in 4 different drainages. And literally each one of those 4 different drainages here had pollution going down it that we had to deal with. Ultimately we reclaimed the pad with 2 foot of non-acid generating material and 2 foot of growth medium. Again, we looked at source control covers that might give us 95 to 99% reduction. We still would have had to treat water at Zortman Landusky. This is the Landusky lower leach pads. Again, you can see most everything on the mine was kind of built right on the crest and on the ridges. So once we got the reclamation plan done, we still end up having to have water capture in all these drainages below here. And that's active water capture, meaning we actually take the water, pump it, send it to water treatment, and then they actually try to send some of the water back to these drainages so we don't deplete the water table. Same thing with Zortman Ruby area. Here we had high sulfide leach piles. These are piles that really didn't leach very well, but they were left in place. And those we had to actually move to backfill a pit. And that pit is designed to capture the water from that pit. It's not, again, just a cure to move it in the pit. So prediction of acid drainage was clearly inadequate. We had an issue with the enforcement of the water quality issues for more than 15 years. Inaccurate cost estimates left the agencies in a position of high vulnerability. Very important, bankruptcy can and will occur. There's no mining company that's going to probably last forever. I worked for Anglo-American Corporation. They're the owners of De Beers Diamonds. They also own most of the airplanes you see flying around the world that are being leased. I worked for them in the 1980s, and they were easily the world's largest mining company, had assets in the order of 10, 15 billion. Today, literally in the last 3 years, they've gone from 60 mines to less than 20. They're now considered maybe number 20 in the world, and they are on the verge of bankruptcy. That's the world's largest mining corporation. And if they went bankrupt, there'd be a huge number of mines. So even the big guys can go bankrupt, particularly I'll tell you the small ones will. And in mining, if it can go wrong, it probably will. And this is a very important lesson. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it today, but in another forum, I would talk about failure modes effects analysis and the dire need to consider what happens when these things fail, so we have plans and monies in place to deal with that failure. Because that's the real key here, is recognizing that things will go wrong, not projecting, as we hear too often, that we got it all figured out and nothing's going to happen here. So talk a bit about PolyMet, and certainly I think all of you in this room know more about PolyMet than I do. I've had a chance to review some of the facilities and look at it, but certainly haven't been involved at the level folks here have. Very important to note, it's an open pit mine with waste rock piles and a tailings storage facility. Just quickly on the tailings storage facility, many of you are aware since Mount Poly in Canada happened that we're viewing tailings storage facilities quite differently. And I was the liaison between the First Nations and the Mount Poly Independent Review Panel, and I worked very closely and have worked closely since then with the members of the review panel on the recommendations. And the idea of tailings storage facilities, they need to be taken very seriously. It may not be that the answer in every case is to use filtered tailings, but I can tell you right now that the mining industry can probably only afford one big accident in the U.S. I don't think the mining industry can afford that. So these tailings facilities need to be looked at very seriously. And in this case, we've got some unique things with the LTV steel mining facility and how they're proposing to use that facility and the existing tailings impoundment. This is something we don't deal with every day in mining, because usually projects are what we call green spring projects. There's nothing there, they build the mine and have to build everything around it. In this case, we have the former LTV steel mining facility, which I think has complicated things somewhat. This is just a picture. I think others are more familiar than I am. This is just the back of the tailings facility back in here. Now, Minnesota has financial assurance requirements, and does anybody here know when Minnesota promulgated those? I was just curious in looking at it, because as I mentioned earlier, every state seems to do something different. So with respect to financial assurance, Minnesota has a contingency reclamation cost estimate. They're the only jurisdiction, to my knowledge, anywhere that I've ever heard using the word contingency. It throws me a little bit in that it's basically based on the following: a current dollar value at the time of the estimate, and cost of commissioner administrating, no salvage values. So that to me is pretty standard, okay? So like any other reclamation and closure financial assurance estimate, and I would mention in particular the no salvage value. I'm not real familiar with what's being proposed for the form of financial assurance here, but I can tell you that salvage value is not accepted by any jurisdiction to my knowledge. And again, clearly here you have that no salvage value can't be attributed. So if they are proposing salvage value, it would seem clearly contradictory to the statute. Now, here's the unusual part. What they're saying is that shall be a contingency reclamation plan, including closure and post-closure maintenance, shall be submitted with the annual report to verify and will be implemented in the coming years. So the plan basically is to implement the contingency plan if operations cease in the upcoming calendar year. So typically in the federal government, for example, BLM, they require that you do the estimates for a 3-year period. And you look at your liability at the end of that 3-year period. Some may look at it at the end of the 5-year. And then what we usually do is, in addition to the 3- and 5-year periods that they're bonding for, we also do a life of mine estimate. And in many cases, companies will volunteer to, instead of just doing the bonding for the next 3 to 5 years, they'll actually volunteer to do life of mine. And we recently saw Barrick Gold agree to do that in Alaska. It was a precedent somewhat. Their actual mine is going to be a 40-year mine life. We think the maximum liability will occur at year 15, and they agreed year 1 that they'll provide the maximum amount of bond for the life of mine rather than look at it every 3 to 5 years. The idea of looking at it every year is really more akin to what we see in Canada, and I've worked with that system up there. The problem is that you really run into, it's a lot of process and things to do a cost estimate, review it, assess the financial assurance. In some cases, we're finding we're literally still in the process when that year occurs. So we're having to ask for extensions and things like that. So it's just something to keep in mind, that the idea of doing a new estimate every year, it's not a bad idea. I actually think it's a good idea because it sets you up if they go bankrupt that next year. But I think you also have to be very careful that you don't look at that as being the only number for your financial assurance. There should be a life of mine and maximum number, and ideally the company should be willing to put up that money because the problem we get into in this case is you'll end up negotiating every year. Well, it needs to increase by 10 million, but we're having a bad year this year, so we don't want it to increase at all. Now, that's the kind of conversation that I would suggest should never occur in financial assurance. You don't want to be adjusting what you do depending on the condition. So it's an interesting aspect. I think what's most important to me is you've got just a few paragraphs of regulation. You have no guidance. What I can tell you is that BLM's written reams of guidance on financial assurance estimation. State of Nevada has, most states, if you're going to have these statutes, you have to provide some guidance because otherwise they're just way too vague. And the company can submit all kinds of things saying it provided this information and still doesn't really give them what they need. So that's one area that's very problematic, is we have statutes that are somewhat high level, and then we have no guidance to actually what's required to carry out those statutes. So want to mention both the good and the bad, because I think it's very important to recognize when folks do things well, as well as to recognize where there's issues. The reclamation cost estimate that's provided is definitely consistent with standard engineering practice. They provide the necessary details, identify the tasks, provide the type of information we would expect to need, and it's done in the way that a professional engineer would do it. I do think it represents an accurate representation of the cost based on the assumptions. Now again, I'm not saying it's the right cost for the project, but what they did do is they gave us assumptions, then they generated costs of that. We might not agree with the assumptions, but the way they generated the costs is something I would agree with. I think this was very important, is they used SRK's standard reclamation cost estimator. I mentioned 25 years ago, you never knew what you were going to see when you opened up one of these. I was pleased, very pleased actually, when I opened this up to see it was done using the standard reclamation cost estimator format, because what that means is, and particularly with the Minnesota specific cost estimate database, that means that it's done in a way that is no different than I would do it if I were calculating it for my purposes, whether it were for a construction project, mining project, whatever. The standard reclamation cost estimator program, it was actually developed about 10 years ago. I was asked to do the beta testing as the perhaps greatest skeptic of the program, and today I advocate that it should be used for every mine everywhere. That way we are always looking at the same format. And again, they've done a very good job in terms of looking at state-specific costs. It appears to accurately reflect the tasks that are described. So what they've described in the plan, I think, is accurately estimated in the costs. And then the direct costs themselves are reasonable, okay? So really what I'm saying is kind of half of the estimate, if you rely upon the assumptions, is good, but not all of it. The estimate includes worst case, so that's another thing that's important. What I'd like to see is them bond for that highest cost, worst case condition up front, year one, so that way we have an assurance that it's there. I do think it's good that they did present a worst case situation, because oftentimes we have to point that out. But this is where it begins to get a little bit problematic. The estimate only includes indirect costs of 5%. Now, as I mentioned, the guidance says 29 to 80%, and I really I'm kind of puzzled as to why the company went ahead and proposed 5%. Certainly isn't a valid or legitimate number in my experience, and it really is interesting when they go through all the effort to do a fairly good job on the upfront part of the estimate, how then this basically just compromises it tremendously. And then the other thing they did that was very unusual, unacceptable in my opinion at least, is they took and used a 8% discount rate and 1.1% inflation to basically end up with a net discount rate of 6.9%, which is incredibly high. The numbers you usually see in the industry are 2.8 to 5%. You would have to be invested in the stock market or something like that to gain a 6.9% return. Would we really want financial assurance monies that are intended to last for a long time, subject to the ups and downs of the stock market? I really don't think so. So this is something that I think is a major issue that I'm hoping your regulators will address. Ideally, we'd be down to 1.5%, 2.8%, somewhere in that range. The other thing that was very unusual to me was they used a 50-year time frame for the estimate. Now, I'm used to seeing 100 years to 500 years. What the basis was for 50, why they used 50, I don't know. I might mention everything I've just said could have been addressed in guidance. And that's normally where we would have seen guidance. For example, say use 100, use 500. Right now, you get what you get. The other thing that's a problem is the long-term cost estimate. Now, it's interesting, they provided us all the details on the year one cost estimate. But the long-term cost estimate, they gave us 3 sheets missing all the details. Somewhat mystified why they would do that, but it doesn't give you a lot of confidence when you review that to know you've actually got those costs correct. Therefore, I would not consider the application to be complete until they provide that information. And I don't know if the state has requested them to provide that more detailed information yet. Originally, the long-term estimate wasn't even included, and I think we brought it to their attention that there was not a long-term estimate, and that's when they provided, I think it's the 3 pages. So this is a graphic really intended to kind of give you some idea of what these issues mean. This is the base case, and they're talking about a net present value of the reclamation and closure plan of $332 million. Now, let me just mention that's a lot of money. That's very significant in the world of mining. We typically see reclamation plans that call for costs of 50 to 100 million. This 332 million would be amongst the top 5 to 10 estimates in the United States for closure costs. On the positive side, that's because it recognizes the long-term monitoring and O&M costs. But this is using the 6.9% and the 5% in direct costs in 30 years. So what I did is I did an estimate number 1, where we increased the duration of the estimate to 500 years. You can see what happens down here. Instead of 436 million, you end up spending close to 3.7 billion over that time. And folks, again, that sounds like a lot of money, but that actually is, that 3.7 billion is what you would expect to spend over those 500 years. And in fact, that's what they, based upon their estimate, would expect to spend if this goes out 500 years. Now, if the net discount rate instead of 6.9% were 2.8%, this is this estimate. So you can see what happened in net present value when you go from 50 to 500, you really don't change things much. Okay, we added on $7 million because that's costs that are occurring way out in the future. And so particularly at a high discount rate, it's not very sensitive. But if all we do is change the discount rate there and there, you see we go from 339 million to 514 million, or essentially about $180 million increase. If the discount rate is 1.5%, that means 754 million. And ultimately, if we put in 30% indirect costs, which is correct, do a 500-year estimate at 1.5%, you see we're getting close to $1 billion in financial assurance. Now, what are the right numbers? We really don't know now. We need more details, we need more study. Without question, I can tell you that the discount rate for financial assurance, yeah, this isn't something where we're putting it out in the stock market and gambling. This is supposed to be there forever. It needs to be ideally in this 1.5% range, at a minimum in the 2.8. So we're talking as much as $500 million up to $1 billion in financial assurance that, in my opinion, needs to be assured up front before the project starts, so that you know you're going to be able to deal with this. This just compares, again, the difference in these discount rates. This is a big issue throughout the country, and I can tell you that the tendency is really heading towards these numbers here, but just to graphically show again how much of a difference in time value of money it makes. And that's it. I'm welcome to answer any questions, or if anybody else wants to make some comments.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Floor is open.
PolyMet has never mined before. Does that go into any of your equations about mining? Because I know they're owned a significant part by Glencore, but have you seen this in other parts of the country, like the Landusky mining?
Yeah, we all the time see mining companies that don't have knowledge of mining. This really doesn't reflect that, okay? Because what we're trying to do here is assume the company's gone bankrupt and gone. So whether or not you have a small company, a large company, that type of thing, I'm really not sure that affects. Also, I guess the point would be that, in my experience, if the company does a good job, they should be hiring internationally known consultants with a high level of experience and other things. So you're not relying upon the company and their number of years and their experience. You're really relying upon a whole team, ideally. And so I work with companies that may not have a lot of other experience, but they bring in really good teams. I work with other companies that aren't, should be bringing good teams that aren't. So I'm just kind of careful to, I think you understand.
You mentioned the storm events at Zortman Landusky. We often hear from PolyMet, maybe not often, but in the EIS, it says that the contingency for dealing with storms is basically to leave enough freeboard in the tailings basin and the mine pit so that when the storm comes, it doesn't overflow, and that's a fairly straightforward problem to deal with. Can you talk more about why the storm events were an issue at that mine and the financial assurance?
Well, yeah, let me come back to your point about the tailings a minute. This has really been important to figure out what kind of storm events, because if a tailings dam starts to overflow, that's when you get a catastrophic release. I'm working on design of 2 tailings impoundments right now with several members of the Mount Poly board. Dirk Van Ziel's involved. We have some other folks involved. We're talking 200 or 500 year storm events. And in fact, for dam design, we're now changing, I should say, dam design is going to probable maximum flood, because we just can't mess with this anymore. So the design features now, we're saying you should go to probable maximum flood. Yes, that requires big structures, but it also assures we won't get those kind of catastrophic failures. We're seeing with climate change, and whether you want to attribute that to it or not, it doesn't matter. What we're seeing is a much higher frequency and of storms, and the actual way the storms occur. We used to take a look at 24-hour events. Now we're realizing that 75–85% of the moisture drops in 6 hours, and it's these very high level, very high intensity events. Also can be rain on snow. In fact, the number one thing we're concerned about for failure mode from a stormwater event is a big snow load, and then you get a wet spring rain on top of it, and basically all hell breaks loose. So no, I think this is a place, a good example of a place where my answer in trying to be protective in this whole thing and try to reduce risk is, I think we need to be very, very conservative with the storm events and use a maximum type event. Yes, sir.
So in PolyMet's permit to mine application, they've talked just very little bit about the financial instruments that they propose to use, and they mentioned the use of surety bonds and the pledging of mine and mine assets as part of the trust fund. Could you maybe comment on those?
Yeah, no, I'd be glad to, because I actually didn't put a slide on the instruments here, and I wish I had. Let me start first with corporate and third party and other guarantees of that type, because I've heard talk of that. I mentioned on the right here that basically I value a corporate guarantee based upon the amount of heat it will produce when I take a match and burn that piece of paper. I've sat in way too many bankruptcy courts and other things trying to argue for 1 or 2 cents off the dollar when companies go bankrupt and they provided corporate guarantees. When ASARCO went bankrupt, there were over $1.1 billion in corporate guarantees that were supposed to guarantee their reclamation of their mines in Arizona and elsewhere. By the time we got through the bankruptcy court, because they weren't properly written, other things, they said maybe there was 110 million, and by the time they got through with everything else, they ended up with, I think, about 30 million for the whole bankruptcy. So corporate guarantees are bad news. Collateral is something that is similarly pretty much unheard of. There are actually various states, Montana's one, that just simply will not accept collateral salvage value. That's my understanding of your statute here in Minnesota. So the idea of pledging any kind of asset is, again, it's not something we typically do in financial assurance. I'm aware of some ranches that Phelps Dodge owns in New Mexico that they've pledged for assets, and I can tell you the state of New Mexico has had to take a 25% discount on those because they realized if the company went bankrupt, all of a sudden they'd be selling a bunch of ranches and they'd flood the market. So from what I understand, without exception, collateral just simply hasn't been accepted as a responsible form of financial insurance. Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
I was going to ask, I think you mentioned that financial assurance should be in place up front. And is the proposal that PolyMet has is to pay for financial assurance out of cash flow to peak in year 11.
Yeah.
Your thoughts on that?
Well, that means you are relying upon their predictions of cash flow. And a good example is if the price goes down, their cash flow doesn't amount to what it should, are they going to come to the state and say, oh, we can't make our payment this next year? They'll still want to mine, but they won't want to make their payment. So I think the only way to guarantee that money is to have it up front. And again, I don't think it's nearly as big an issue for these companies as they suggest. They can get a surety bond. I have heard suggestions that surety bonds are tight. They might be in the future. They certainly are not right now. Probably 90% of the liability for the mining industry is in the form of surety bonds, including for long-term treatment.
And is that a viable surety bond? Is that worth the value of the paper, or how would you characterize it?
I would care. We've had no problem, to my knowledge, collecting on surety bonds. Now, if you have a total economic collapse of the world, AIG and a couple of other big insurers, because every bonder is reinsured by others, collapses. Yeah, it collapses, but I would expect pretty much the whole monetary system in the world to collapse along with it. So from the standpoint of reliability, I'm not aware of issues where we haven't been able to collect on surety bonds. The original surety bonds that were being written were a little bit problematic because of the way they were written. There were line item exclusions, and we've removed those. And so I think surety bonds are a good form of financial assurance. I generally, you would want one from a first-class institution. That's a necessity. And then the other is, you just like with any other thing, you have to review that every year. And you may need to look at shifting it or transferring it. So cash would by far be preferable. I won't suggest anything else, but I just don't think it's always possible.
Let me just build on the assured. So if you're talking about, you were throwing figures around of 300 million, 500 million, so let's say it's 500 million. What would the firm be out? What would the company be out in terms of buying an insurance bond in order to guarantee that?
Well, so let's assume that they can get the whole 500 million through a surety bond. Typically, the cost of that is 1 to 2 cents on the dollar. So basically, on an annual basis, to get 500 million, they would be looking at about 5 million. Okay, that's a lot of money, but it's still not that high a price. when you account for that as part of your operations and things.
Okay, but that's an annual, so that'd be 5
Yeah,
million.
so it's $5 million each year to maintain that surety bond. Yep.
And if they miss a year?
The surety company can cancel. So this is the whole key, and again, how it's written is if they miss, the state has the ability to continue the surety and to actually call on the surety, and so you have to have really smart attorneys, people who understand contract law and other aspects, write these up. There are some standard forms out there that have been written up that I'd strongly recommend people use, not just whatever the company walks in with. Yes?
This reminds me a little bit of being a corporate attorney before the 2008 crash, when people said, don't worry, there's high quality reinsurance market on mortgage-backed securities, and it's not failed before, don't worry. And so surety bond markets, like, what I understand about modeling as lawyer, not modeler, is that there are these low probability, very catastrophic events that aren't well modeled. So if it turns out that that's true, isn't there a risk that, I know you're saying like the end of the world could happen, right? I get that, I worked at an environmental institute. But short of that, there could be the surety market collapses.
Yeah,
That's
again,
not the end of the world.
I would not suggest to you it can't happen. It absolutely can happen. So that's why, again, I would prefer cash. I think the problem we have is there's just only X amount of cash out there. And so trying to put that burden on the companies, that's why allowing surety bonds, certainly the sooner you can eliminate that surety bond. For example, what I'd prefer to see if there was a surety bond is the company actually take that first 10 years to replace that with cash, to eliminate that risk, if you will. Because again, I think there's always going to be some level of risk. Even with a cash trust, I don't think there's zero risk. Yes?
You mentioned some mines that have, that you say sort of did it right. Can you sort of walk through what those kinds of setups look like? And also, are there states that you say sort of lead the way in terms of doing it right?
So you have two states that really, because, I'd say three, that because we got burned, we've learned the hard way and we do better. I'm not going to say doing it right, but do better. New Mexico is probably at the top of my list. They've dealt with some very large mines. They've incorporated a lot of the things I'm talking about here. They have a lot of good guidance as to how to calculate net present value, long-term costs, various things, indirect costs, things like that. Alaska has done a better job, and more recently, give some credit to Barrick Gold at the Donlin project. It's not a project that's extremely popular, but what they've done with their financial assurance, particularly how they calculated it, establishing that worst case cost and being willing to put the money up for the worst case up front, from what we understand. That's a good example, and the state has had a lot to do with that. Montana, where I come from, we've done some things to really improve things. I'm not going to give the state too much credit because what happened there was we reacted to the situation with Zortman-Landusky, and for about 10 years seemed to be doing a good job, and then the next 10 years they've really done, quite honestly, a lousy job. So it's one thing I would say to folks is one of the problems with this whole discussion is we rely upon the regulators to a very high degree in this discussion, and if there was some way to not have to rely upon them in all this, it might be better.
And also, do you find that most states kind of improve quickly after they've had serious problems?
They do, because their citizens are kind of mad about having to invest the money. So Montana is a good example. Montana improved. At the same time, the Citizens Passed an initiative that said no more of these open pit cyanide leach mines that are connected with these actions. So, yeah. When that happens, it does create a very negative thing. That's why I really would say to the mining industry, you don't want this to happen. They want to get things set up. The mining industry should take the responsibility to have it in a way that this risk is minimized for their sake.
Can you, you mentioned Alaska, can you cite another mine, actually of copper, that has done it right?
Copper. Well, you know, again, and I want to be very careful doing it right.
Well, I mean,
Yeah, doing it better. I mean, again, mining is a very difficult practice anyway, so I'm trying to almost make sure we don't try to present it as something that's going to be clean. But Let me think. In Alaska, well, there's a number of different examples. Greens Creek, which is a lead, zinc, silver, copper. The Greens Creek mine, which is owned by Hecla, and it's actually in a national monument in Alaska. Admiralty Island National Monument, and they've been operating there for about 20 years. Now again, they've had a history of problems and a history of solutions to those problems. So that's an example of a mine that I can think of that presently the numbers are worked out pretty well. We do the same thing at other mines. So there's a number of, I'd probably give you 100 examples of where they're doing things better, okay? And then another 100 examples, because there's about 200 mines out there, of where they're not doing things better.
What about in a water-rich environment like this? It's flat,
It's challenging, okay? Anytime you're working close to water, and my work is, I've actually done quite a bit of work looking at predictions. Anytime you're working close to water, the chances of having a water quality issue go up essentially from, say, roughly 10% to greater than 90%. So, yes. Best example is if you take a whole bunch of mines in Nevada, they can have poor characteristics. They can have acid drainage, selenium, lots of other issues, but it's over 1,000 foot to groundwater, might be 10, 20, 30 miles to the nearest surface water. So their impacts are much different, much less than those where we have essentially where we're locating the mine right directly on water. So when we're doing a mine like this, it takes a great deal more precaution, a lot more mitigation in terms of engineering controls. When you put in your liners, you have to make sure they aren't going to float on top of water. It's, from my viewpoint, technically, it takes a higher level of acumen to do things in a wet climate. And there's a higher risk that things go wrong, no question.
You said that their initial $330 million estimate was quite a bit higher than most mines that are 15 to 20 million. Can you say a little bit about some of the reasons?
Yeah, well, the water treatment. Okay, so if you look at their reclamation costs, their dirt work costs, that's in line with what we typically see. It's that need for water treatment. So that's where you saw the graphic where it was showing it goes from 10 to hundreds of millions. That's exactly what we're talking about. This mine might be, in the $50 to $100 million cost to reclaim without the need to deal with water. But because of the water issues, that basically increases roughly an order of magnitude. Yes, sir.
So PolyMet is still claiming that they are actively working on a passive water treatment system for this that would significantly reduce those
So
costs.
is the rest of the world.
Yeah. So is there anything out there that is like
No. This whole discussion of passive and active treatment is one that I spent a lot of time on. Wish I didn't waste any of my time on it because it's quite tiresome. Passive treatment, where we have examples, and let me just quickly, the idea of difference between passive and active. Passive, you build it, and you just walk away from it, and it runs forever, no problem, and solves the problem. No such thing. There is no passive treatment. Semi-passive, yes. If you look at the GUARD guide, that's the guide for acid rock drainage, all the industry publications, they acknowledge semi-passive. When somebody uses passive, I can't help but wonder what they're trying to convince somebody of, because it's not passive. You'll have to have people come in and change media, various other things. But having said all that, the difference between passive and active, the only passive plants I know that are working effectively are operating at volumes of less than 15 gallons per minute. In fact, the majority of them are less than 10 gallons per minute. We're not talking those kind of flows here, not even remotely those kind of flows. So the idea that passive, certainly it's worth the research. We're trying to develop it. It may be something for the future. To claim any reduction in cost, to substitute passive versus active today, I wouldn't think would be fair. I'm not sure if the company, it doesn't appear to me in their cost estimate. I think their cost estimate is based upon active treatment through year 50. So I don't think they've actually projected, they've just suggested they might be able to, but I don't think they've incorporated that assumption in the financial assurance. And certainly if, 100 years from now, they can prove an active or a passive water treatment plant can work for that kind of volume, great. Let's let her run and eliminate the financial assurance. But let's prove that first. I'd say we need at least a 20-year proof of concept.
Oh, one last question. You get the last one.
All right, thank you. We often hear that that area in Minnesota is the largest undeveloped copper deposit in the world. Could you characterize, from what you know about the industry?
Well, everybody wants to have the largest copper deposit in the world. There are other deposits that I certainly think, okay, I think it has the potential to be a very, very large resource. And that's the part that people don't really know. The talk I hear is that the complex could contain, enormous amounts of ore reserves and other riches, but we really don't know that yet. When we talk about an ore resource, I'm thinking of something that's been drilled out, that's been modeled, that's been calculated, and you don't have that here yet. I mean, we have much, much larger copper deposits throughout North America, quite honestly, based upon present knowledge. But I'm not going to say it isn't, that the future couldn't mean you have a very, very large copper complex here. So,
Great.
thanks.
Thank you,
Really
Jim.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
Appreciate all the questions.